Hey there, political orphans, swing voters, independents, that whole gang. Welcome to a special edition of Lost in the Middle. We're going to do a countdown between the middle of September and work our way up till Election Day. And we sort of switched out the format. This won't be storytelling the way we do things, but instead what I'm doing is talking to some of the smartest political podcast hosts in the country. But before we go there, I want to tell you a quick story. When I left Congress, it was sort of running up to the 2000 election, and I got a call from a good friend of mine named Brady Williamson. And Brady said, I've got an idea for you. What's that? He said, let's try to get a political debate in Madison, because it would be interesting in the 2000 election. And Brady had worked for the Clintons for years and was a Democratic operative. And I said, let's rock and roll. So we reached out to what was then called the Political Debate Commission, which everybody thought was an official arm of the federal government, but instead it was just a cozy room between a longstanding Republican and a longstanding Democratic operative who figured out a way to make money on this. And the deal was you had to raise $500,000 because the presidential debate is a television operation. And so the first thing we had to do was raise, I think it was $200,000 to show that we were serious, which actually was much easier than we thought it would be. We had a couple of large Madison businesses step forward, and then some foundations locally, and then we're ready to rock and roll. And then out come the folks who actually scout the presidential debate. And so we wandered around Madison looking for venues. And so the whole Madison community was geeked about the idea. And then they wanted to show off the new Madison Civic Center, which had been designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And they walked in the room, and we probably spent maybe 3.5 minutes in it, because if you've ever seen anything designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, it may be brilliant, but it's weird. And every section we looked, there was a column or a weird thing. Walked out of that. Then went to the old Oscar Mayer Theater. Yes, Madison was the home of Oscar Mayer Wieners and the Wienermobile. And they liked that a lot, but it was a really cool old building and would have great angles to look down on the audience and looked very ornate and very rich. And then it turned out by the time they built out the stage downstairs, there'd be no time for sitting. So that went out the window. And so we ended up with the Madison Expo Center, which was just basically a big box. So it was a weird year because the Olympics were that fall and the World Series was really late. And so they decided at the end of the day, they're going to have to do all of the 4 debates, 3 presidential and 1 vice presidential, in a very compressed time frame. So we're sitting around like the NFL draft waiting for the phone to ring. And they pick up the phone and say, Brady, Scott, we've got some great news for you. Okay. We want you to host the vice presidential debate. It's like, who the hell watches the vice presidential debate, much less trying to raise $500,000 to stage it? And as we're looking through sort of depressed glasses at one another, they say, here's the date. And they pick a weekend in October in a great Wisconsin story that's not a punchline. It was the World Dairy Expo in Madison, Wisconsin. We were off the hook. You could not find a hotel room because people with trailers and pickup trucks were driving their prize Holsteins to Dane County, Wisconsin to show them off. So our prize for doing that was actually we got tickets to go to the presidential debate in Boston. Al Gore and George Bush. The highlight of the night for me personally was that Christy Brinkley sat in front of me with purple, sort of eggplant colored leather pants. And let's just say it was not a particularly good look. But the defining moment of the debate was Al Gore doing this every time George Bush started to answer a question. And it's literally graded by historians as one of the 10 worst debate moments in U.S. presidential history. So we never ended up with the debate here, but we just all watched the debate. And I want to turn around to my guest, Andrew Heaton, who's actually calling us in from Scotland, from a phone booth in a men's businessman club, I take it is, Andrew?
I'm at the Royal Scots Club, which is just a nice, stuffy club that has allowed me to become a member. I like to work out of here, and being a humble boy from Oklahoma, I find it endlessly funny to talk to old British men in 3-piece suits. So when I come to Scotland to avoid the Texan weather for about a month a year, and then I work out of here.
Well, you can tell by the early introduction. So Andrew actually hosts a podcast much aligned with us called The Political Orphanage. So that means my political orphans actually live in his political orphanage when they turn into his podcast, which is terrific. Mm-hmm. He's been a stand-up comedian. He's performed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. He's written a bunch of books, including one that's called Laughter is Better Than Communism. And he actually opened up for William Shatner, who said, wow, that Andrew guy, he's pretty funny. But the cool thing is, and most people won't know this, and I actually know this because my youngest son spent some time in comedy, is you performed with Upright Citizens Brigade in L.A., which is sort of the West Coast version of Second City who don't know it. So...
Yeah, we was New York, but yes, the UCB, it had, at the time, it had outposts on both coasts. And I got improvisational training from the good people at UCB. And so I have a certificate saying I'm funny. I have it on my wall. UCB is I'm licensed to be funny by UCB.
That's terrific. And then worked on the Hill for Tim Holden, who's an old buddy of mine, who was a Democrat from Pittsburgh. We used to play in the congressional baseball game together. And Tim actually had one of the worst moments I've ever seen because he and Bill Jefferson, another Democrat from Louisiana, who later on got sentenced to prison for racketeering, but that's an entirely different story. Tim was at first base. Bill was at catcher. Somebody popped up in the middle of the first base and home plate, and they collided head on. And Steve Largent was playing with us, former NFL football player, who said that was the ugliest collision I've ever seen, worse than anything I'd ever seen in the NFL. And Tim got gashes, Jefferson got teeth knocked out, everything in the world. So now that I've completely wasted everybody's time for 8 or 9 minutes with a story that went nowhere, let's talk about your impressions of the debate. Does it really matter? Did it really change anybody's mind?
Yes, I think they do. So I was very skeptical of the debates up until about 3 months ago. I'm one of these people that is angry at what had been the Presidential Commission on Debates because it seemed to me that they were intentionally icing out any third-party candidates that would come in, and I was ruffled about that. I was angry that Gary Johnson had approached whatever metric they needed, and then they immediately put it up to 10% in order to ice him out, and was taking the rather cynical view of like, look, everyone in America has made up their mind about Biden and Trump. This is before Biden dropped out. No one needs any additional information. It's not as if Trump is some sort of coy, opaque figure that we don't know a lot about. And I have changed my tune on that completely. I watched the debate between Biden and Trump, and I had been likewise kind of skeptical about the whole Biden mental acuity thing, because that sounded to me like kind of a made-up Republican talking point. And then I, like much of the rest of the country, watched the president's brains drain out of his ears like motor oil and went, apparently they were right about this. We have been gaslit, America. So I thought that the debate did a really good public service at that point. The most recent, so for that reason, I think the debates are good, just because they do allow you to see if somebody's truly crazy or not. I don't think that they're particularly salient for policy discussions, and the latest debate was not salient for policy discussions. But I think that they can be useful in that regard. In terms of pushing people to vote in a particular direction, yes. My understanding is that last-minute voters tend to be disproportionately affected by the personalities they see on display at the debates, and by bombardments of advertising that get them the last couple of weeks. So for most people that are plugged into politics, and I would imagine that that's the bulk of your audience, they probably have their own internal compass that they're using and some kind of metric they're using to make decisions in terms of who they're going to vote for that involves ideology and policy goals and character or something to that effect, right? I think there is a group of people, and they're ultimately who's going to determine this election, which are not nearly that attuned to politics. And so for them, they're running a lot of this off of gut feelings and vibes. And in that capacity, I think it's going to really benefit Kamala Harris, because my personal suspicion is I'm telling all the Scots while I'm here, I'm putting it 60-40 on Kamala Trump. I think she's going to take it. It's going to be razor thin, but I think that she's probably going to take it. And my rationale for this is that I think the last-minute voters that are not reliably Republican or Democrat are going to basically go, I don't know, I associate Trump with old screamy guys. I don't know, I don't like that. Let's give this new lady a try. She seems sane. And Kamala did a good job of appearing sane and reasonably normal for the course of the debate. And so I think that vibe will work to her advantage.
So who's left that hasn't made up their mind?
I think it is the swing, like the truly swing voters, right? So I'm an independent, and I'm a big critic of the two-party system, and I will kind of join people in breathlessly talking about how wonderful it is that independents are gaining traction, and they're now the largest voting bloc. They're larger than Republicans or Democrats. But when you really look at it, the majority of independents, probably about 80%, are reliably Republican or Democratic voters, but they just really don't like the party. And so it's almost like a protest that they're registering as an independent, but they're going to vote Republican or Democrat. That leaves about 20%. And half of those people, I think, are like me, where we are very plugged in, but we have our own aberrant, weird Rorschach test that we're applying to American politics, which means we're not permanently in the pocket of either camp. But I think that there's another group of people that, for them, they're living their lives, and they're thinking about work and thinking about their kids, and they're not really thinking about politics. And so they're a lot more affected by how they would judge a used car salesman, which is like, does this person seem honest? Does this person seem like they're going to be the person who's going to sell me the right car? Are they going to swindle me? Can they get things done? Are they going to be a good boss? They're going with personality attributes to a great extent. And I think those are the kind of swing voters that will be swayed by the debate.
I think for folks who are political junkies, it's hard to understand. I mean, I keep running into people who say there can't be any undecided voters. They can't be, but there are. And I think people have a hard time comprehending that. And, the interesting thing is if you talk to political consultants, I spent a bunch of time arguing with Mike Murphy over this idea, whether they're independents or really they're just closet Republicans or closet Democrats. If you talk to the folks at Arizona State and Tom Riley, who runs the only political science department in the country, which has a specific study of independent voters, he'll tell you there are a significant chunk. And if you look, you can see it for yourself. If you look at the vote totals in 2012, they went dramatically for Obama. Then they turned around and shifted to Trump. And then in 20, they shifted around and voted for Clinton. So I do think there's a group that is permanently disengaged with either of the major political parties. But we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, Andrew, I want to talk to you about why I think your analysis is wrong on the debate, because I want to tell you the two issues that I think are trouble for Harris.
Right.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. Our country recognizes homeownership as one of the best ways to build wealth and stable communities. But over the years, support for homeownership has dwindled, and our leaders have lost sight of its value. We're working to change that. The American Property Owners Alliance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that holds our leaders accountable to safeguard homeowners and communities. Visit propertyownersalliance.org to learn more and find out how you can join our efforts.
Well, welcome back, and we're just beginning our conversation with Andrew Heaton, who's a great political podcast host on a podcast called The Political Orphanage. He's done a lot of comedy work. He's written a whole bunch, and he and I think share a lot of sort of similar framing of how we think this election goes. So if
I'll even add to that, Scott. You were kind enough to come on my program, The Political Orphanage, and you think so similar to me that it kind of freaked me out. And at one point, I began postulating that you might be me from the future who'd come back to talk to me in the past. It was very unnerving.
Well, we can probably sell that as a pilot to CBS or somebody.
Yeah, I like that. Time-traveling pundits, yeah.
So there's, sort of two framing things you have to do in elections. Well, there's actually three. I mean, if you and I are running against each other, I have to define you, right? And then I have to define who I am. And then the third thing is you have to figure out what issues you're running on. And sometimes that's good for you and sometimes it's bad for you. And I think the problem for Harris is going to be, as we get closer to those undecided voters, it's people who weren't thrilled with what the economies looked like the last 4 years. And I think, and again, I'm not a fan of the former president, as anybody who listens to this show knows. But I just think at the end of the day, it's people who are still worried about the cost of gas, the cost of bread, about taking their kids to McDonald's, about canceling a summer vacation. I think those folks are going to look and say, wow, Trump's really a strange guy, but it was better than he was president.
That could be the case. I mean, I think one of the other things that Kamala is doing that is a strategic decision that may or may not benefit her is she's intentionally trying to remain a kind of Schrodinger's candidate, where when she ran in 2020, as Trump has pointed out multiple times, she ran as a very progressive candidate and then flamed out before Iowa, whereas now she has tacked much more to the center and is emphatically in favor of fracking and all of the things that more centrist Democrats would favor. When I was at the Democratic National Convention last month, it was lots of really good vibes. Everybody was really happy. The AOC wing of the party was really happy with her. They were thrilled with Tim Walz. The Obama free trade wing of the party liked her. Everybody liked her. And so she had a kind of internal rationale not to cease being a quantum candidate and really define herself because she'd alienate one wing or the other. And she's kind of started doing that because she's released some policy papers, so you can now actually get a feel for what she's allegedly going to do. But I think she's kind of playing that same card at the general election. And I do think it'll help in terms of the people that are just going off of vibes because they're just going to see a fresh face and go, I don't know, let's try a new one. In terms of the economy, you might have a point there. The polls indicate that people associate Trump with a better economy. I have a lot of qualms with that, and that I am very much in favor of free trade and think tariffs are stupid. So I have a lot of problems with his economic model, but that seems to be earned or unearned the benefit that he gets. He gets like a +5 in economy.
Yeah, which is interesting. And then the other issue, which isn't hot for her either, is immigration. And so that's why I think she did a marvelous job in the debate making the case for the case against the Republicans on abortion, which I thought was really the high moment of the campaign. And now let's talk about the low moment of the campaign. People eating pets in casseroles in Ohio, which seems, I appreciate the fact that CBS fact-checked it, but did you really need to fact-check that?
All right. There's two ways we can look at American politics going forward. We can either be very sad or we can find it very funny. I've decided to find it very funny. I have decided to treat this more like a sitcom than a Black Mirror episode. And looking at it with the sitcom analysis, I thought that whole moment was very funny because the precipitating moment to that was Kamala obviously baiting Donald Trump in a way that you could see from a million miles away, where I don't remember what the actual thing they were discussing was. Probably it wasn't the border. It was something else, the economy. I don't know. And she went, I invite people to watch a Trump rally because what you will find is that people leave early because they find it boring and exhausting. And I saw that and I was like, there's no, like any other political candidate would go, well, that's just, like that's not really pertinent to what we're discussing here. But Trump could not, in a million years, Trump cannot let that go. So he immediately had to come back with our rallies are amazing. And then after that, he was so addled. That's when he stepped into they're eating cats line. And yes, I think the weird analysis that I have been seeing of the debate is where a lot of the pro-Trump people are saying, the moderators were fact-checking Trump much harder than Kamala Harris. And I'm like, yes, I agree on that. However, the whole they shouldn't have fact-checked him as hard on immigrants are eating cats line, to me, is just not a really good strategy. I'm saying, if only they hadn't fact-checked him on that, he'd be doing okay. I don't think so.
But the flip side of that, and I thought ABC did a pretty good job and tried to balance it. And I think the mics being muted, while it didn't make for as much street theater, at least you got to hear what people were saying rather than, it's my turn to talk, it's my turn to talk. But I was troubled by the fact they asked one question about her policy flips. She answered it on fracking without pushing her, and then they never went back to the other stuff, which I thought let her off far too easy. And that bothers me. I mean, I generally, as somebody who spent 14 years in journalism, still spend lots of time on the journalism board at Northwestern University. I find a lot of the coverage, unfortunately, skewed. Do you agree with me on that?
Wholeheartedly, yes. I know you played board games when you were in high school, Scott. Did you ever play Dungeons and Dragons by chance?
I wasn't that weird. I played Risk and games in a couple of
Nice. I was a big Risk guy. In D&D, you've got character attributes, and you'll roll your character attributes of how strong you are and how smart you are. And in American politics, Republicans just kind of get a +5 automatically on the economy, and they get a +5 on defense. And Democrats just get like a +10 on integrity from the media. Like they just, you by virtue of being a Democrat, you automatically get kind of a soft glove there. I didn't think that the moderators were in the can for Kamala, but I agree. I think generally speaking, that the people that are running those debates are probably trying to be even-handed, but they're personally very invested in Trump losing. And as a result, they're overzealous in fact-checking him, and I think that goes back to like Romney and Obama. So yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that the media scrutiny is a lot harder. It's arguably one of the benefits of Trump, because I'm also not a Trump guy, but one of the benefits of Trump is that I think he actually compels journalists to do their job. When Biden, like I as a like turn your head and squint level journalist, like I could technically be a journalist depending on how you're looking at me. I view myself as in a positive adversarial relationship with politicians, the same way that a prosecutor is in a positive adversarial relationship with a defense attorney. There's an emergent order that comes out of the system by virtue of both parties squaring off against each other. So I don't want to take the position of just liking people in power from one side and disliking the other. I think we should always be putting pressure on them. And when Biden won the last election, the fact checker for CNN just went on vacation. And I looked at that and was like, but this is the exact time that you should be fact checking the incoming guy when he's like this is the time to really. But the attitude was the threat is over. The threat is over. We can all go home now. And yes, I think that becomes a big problem with legacy media.
Well, and I think there's a big problem with legacy media, too, in terms of diversity, right? You saw the big kerfuffle when one of the NPR editors quit because when he did a check of where his fellow reporters were registered, you can do that at the political rolls in Virginia and Washington and Maryland because it's all a public record. There were no Republicans. It was 93-0. And famously, you know, in the study that was done by Nate Silver, it was only 6% of journalists self-identified as Republicans. So not that they're making things up, but it would help if they had a little different perspective and didn't think the world would be solved by 5 more government programs. Here's the team behind Lost in the Middle. Executive producer Jeff Mayers. Producer Todd Elbaugh. Edited by Aaron Zummers. Production at Civic Media. And a quick thanks to our partners at the American Property Owners Alliance. So this is Scott Klug with a special countdown edition of Lost in the Middle. My guest is Andrew Heaton, great political observer on his podcast, The Political Orphanage, where my political orphans live, and also does lots of great work, including comedy and writing novels. So, Andrew, if I could, let's talk a little bit about election night. There you are with a bag of cheese popcorn and Diet Coke, watching the results roll in. So tell me what state, corner of the country that intrigues you.
Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the corner that intrigues me. I hail from Oklahoma, but I've got a very good idea of how Oklahoma's going to vote, which is probably Republican. Like in Oklahoma, every 4 years, it's really a debate between like, is the Republican going to win, or are like enough people going to write in Reagan's ghost that like the Republican gets like half the vote? Like Oklahoma's going to go Republican, right? It's the holster of the Bible Belt. So I find Pennsylvania very intriguing, partly because Pennsylvania's typically a bellwether for the entire country. I think only one election out of the last 10 has not gone to the winner of the national contest. And it also is such a linchpin. The math works out that it's virtually impossible for the Democrats to win if they don't get Pennsylvania. And it's very difficult for the Republicans. It's not impossible, but difficult for the Republicans to win if they don't take Pennsylvania. So it's a real keystone within the process. And I find that fascinating. That's the one that I'm looking at.
Well, and it's interesting because, Pennsylvania is such a large and diverse state that if you don't know much about it, it's pretty hard to get your arms around, right? So you've got Philadelphia, which is very Democratic, as is most of the east part, with the exception of some of the more affluent suburbs around Philadelphia. As we all know, however, the suburbs are now tending much more purple. And then you get Pittsburgh in the middle, which is sort of very working class. And the place that everybody really looks at, which is strange, is Erie, Pennsylvania. So we actually did a section of Erie, Pennsylvania in our podcast episode about the 7 counties you should watch election night. And Erie's weird. I remember when I interviewed one of the people for the show, you always are trying to do, sort of a little bit of chit chat before you dive into things. And I said, so, hey, big Steelers or Eagles fan? And I thought the person on the other line was going to come through the phone and choke me on the spot because he said, do you know where we are on the map? We're 20 minutes from Cleveland, and I'm a Browns fan. Every day Philadelphia loses is a good day. Every day the Steelers lose is a good day as long as my Browns do well. So here's a little corner tucked up on one of the Great Lakes in the far northwestern corner and has this strange propensity to vote for the winning party at the White House, I think 8 of the last 9 elections. So Pennsylvania is a good one to pick. And then any other place that interests you or any other demographic trends that intrigue you?
Yeah, well, I'd say more broadly, the general demographic trends that interest me is that the kind of monolithic ethnic bloc that the Democrats have enjoyed for the last 20, 30 years is slowly dissipating. So it boggles my mind that Trump outperformed Mitt Romney with African Americans and with the Hispanic vote, but he did, and then he beat himself again in 2020. So the African American vote's still very much in the Democratic camp, I think by like 80%, 75, 80, 90%. It's high up there. The Hispanic vote is maybe 75, 25, I think. But both of them have slowly started drifting over to the Republican side. And I see it as a part of a much broader realignment that we're living through right now. I think it's kind of like when the Republican Party and the Democratic Party coalesced into national party. Like if you go back to like 1960, the Democratic Party was this unholy alliance of like hippies out in Berkeley, but also the Jim Crow South. And the Republican Party was this unholy alliance of Rockefeller Republicans and moderates like George Romney and hardcore ideologues like Barry Goldwater. And that all kind of shifted around. And I think we're going through that now, where the Republican Party that used to be the party of Mr. Burns is becoming the dive bar party, and the Democratic Party that used to be the Union Party is becoming the party of the managerial and the college educated. And so there's this flip in terms of the economic order and in terms of the educational order. And I think as that is happening, the Democrats are kind of taking for granted that they're going to always enjoy the Democratic bloc they have of non-white voters. And it's not big enough to alter stuff just yet, but I do see this drift happening, and I don't think the Democrats are fully aware of what might come down the pike in a few years.
Well, and black women are clearly the cornerstone of the Democratic coalition, but black men are drifting further. Young black men in particular are drifting towards Trump. And Hispanic voters, it's interesting, there was a book written in 2000 or 2001 by Rudy Tahira, who's the demographer, who's a Democrat, said the coming Democratic majority. And his theory was, okay, as the country becomes less white, becomes more black, more Hispanic, that will add to the existing Democratic coalition, and we'll have, sort of this juggernaut that can't be challenged. Except what happens is I join your party, and then you go, the hell, I don't want to be in a party with Klug, and then you go to a different party. So there's this constant churn that goes on. And he now says that he was crazy because what he couldn't see coming is exactly what you described, was that Hispanics are becoming more and more Republican. And people say, why is that? Well, first of all, Hispanics are not monolithic, right? The Venezuelans and the Cubans in Miami are a hell of a lot different than the Puerto Ricans in New York and the city of Chicago. But if you look at it demographically, Hispanics tend to be Catholic or evangelical. Their faith matters to them. Big families. And I think they find a lot of the Democratic talking points, the sort of called wokeness checklist, which we could do, actually pushes them away from the Democrats. And I think it's the cultural shift that's really benefiting Republicans. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that that's probably part of it. The wokeness element that you see in the Democratic Party is overwhelmingly pushed by upper middle class white people who went to a nicer high school than you. That's the bulk of the people doing that. Like in my comedy experience, the people that I'm a fairly flaccid Garrison Keillor level comedian. I'm not very angry or bitey or anything like that. But in the rare instances where I offend people, it tends to be upper middle class white people offended on behalf of somebody else that wasn't offended.
And actually is laughing at what you just said, probably.
Yeah, he was probably laughing at what I said. And so the kind of wokeness thing to me, my theory remains, I think that wokeness, broadly, however we want to define it, is a kind of nascent religion that's percolating in the United States, and it's very much associated with the elite and Democratic circles. And it's not emblematic of the entire Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is much less politically correct than the top portion of it. Like you see this in a lot of the individual polls where affirmative action is very unpopular in the United States, including among black people. Like overall within the Democratic Party, like affirmative action and racial quotas remain predominantly negative. It's within this clique of upper middle class white voters within the Democratic coalition that are doing that. And so I can totally see that kind of alienating people that are not a part of it.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago doing some work for the State Department where they send former members of Congress to go do previews for. I was in Stockholm, for example, and you talk to university classes, you talk to editors, you try to explain how the Electoral College works, which is something I probably have to do in suburban Madison as well to explain it to people because they really don't get it. And my colleague, centrist Democrat from Ohio, I first got elected with years ago, suddenly started to talk about Latin women as Latinx. And it was like, what is that word you're using? I've never heard it in the past. And it's actually a term that Hispanics are offended by. And it came out of some university campus where they make stuff up like this all the time.
Yes, I've seen the same stuff. It's like some amount of Hispanic people use the term, but it's like less than 10%. And there's a larger percentage of people that are offended by it. And you get into this odd position where I, as a white person, am lecturing a brown person about the language they have because I have decided that my kind of re-microwave Puritanism determines that you can't have gendered language. And you start thinking about it. Isn't it weird that I'm lecturing brown people on how to identify themselves? That seems like a bad call.
I'm with you. So how did you get from comedy to doing a political podcast?
Circuitously and largely through failure, multiple times. So I was interested in comedy and politics back through college. So I was doing all the standard political stuff of paging for the state capitol and student government and things like that. And I was also writing a column for the newspaper that was very much inspired by Dave Barry, who remains a hero of mine. So I was fascinated by humor. But being from Oklahoma, I had, everybody I knew was, in farming, law, or prison. I didn't know any comedians, and I did not know that was an option available to people, that you could get paid for it. So I was really fascinated by it, but never did it. I finally did stand-up right before I graduated college and failed abysmally because I didn't know you had to write jokes in advance, which you and probably all of your listeners would have figured out immediately. I literally thought if you were funny, you just went on stage and jokes came into your brain. That's not how it works. And so I ended up not doing stand-up for a couple more years. But I wound up working as a staffer in D.C. for Tim Holden, your old friend. And I would do stand-up at night and work for Congress during the day. And
did sometimes you get confused which of them was funnier?
Yeah, They were both good sources of inspiration on a regular basis. I then came over to Edinburgh, where I am now. I got my master's degree over here, but I kept doing comedy at night. I was for a while, the resident comedian at Edinburgh's Saturnalia Cabaret. So I came up and told jokes in between a gal that took her clothes off and a guy that ate light bulbs. And I think that was probably the best fit I've ever had comedically. I really did well there. And came back to Washington, D.C., and was going to ensconce myself back in the political scene and work for Congress again and stuff. And it wasn't really clicking for me, and I ended up doing kind of odd jobs. And I finally went, if I'm just going to be doing weird, odd jobs anyway, why don't I go do that comedy thing that I want to do deep down? And so I moved to New York to do stand-up comedy, and I wound up working in television. And at some point, they kind of merged. I was I was scraping by, and a television show approached me, and they went, "We're going to be starting a new television show. It's going to be with libertarian hosts. We heard you're funny and you like Milton Friedman. Is that true?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm funny and I like Milton Friedman a lot." And like, I'm one of like 5 people in the country that's funny and like Milton Friedman. So I ended up doing that, and it eventually kind of merged in my mind where I went, "Oh, I could combine these. I could be funny about politics." And the upshot is that I saw a market for it in that there's not a lot of funny people that aren't broadly a part of the Democratic coalition. And I'm an independent. I kind of lean libertarian. And so I thought, well, there's this. It's basically me and PJ O'Rourke. Like, we're it. So like, there's a big market there. I didn't realize that everybody would hate me half the time because I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. No one had explained that bit to me, that being in the middle is not good. But I get by. I do okay.
So what attracts you to the libertarian philosophy? I mean, I know you're not a libertarian. I'm describe myself as being from the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. Small government, stay out of my life, stay out of my business, stay out of my bedroom, stay out of my church. I get that. Are we growing, or are we like some weird dinosaurs roaming the earth?
I hate to say it, but I think we're the dinosaurs roaming the earth. I mention that because while I'm here in Scotland, I routinely invoke Adam Smith and refer to him as our greatest president, and no one catches me on it. Very few people are aware of Adam Smith, and when I explain them, they're like, "No, it's wrong. No, greed's bad. Get rid of greed." So, yeah, I think we're there. I think what appeals to me about libertarianism is the same thing that appeals to you about your wing of the party, which is a classical liberal philosophy. And I get there, using some wonky terms here, in a fairly utilitarian capacity. It's not that I hate government. I would like government if I thought it worked well. What I care about is people doing well, people being happy, there being a prosperous, free, safe country, all of those things. And so I tend to think more in terms of best practices. And so if you're going to take somebody's stuff without their permission, or you're going to force them to do something without their consent, I think the onus should be on you to explain why that's a really big problem necessary to abrogate somebody's liberty. And a second onus of explain why your solution is actually going to fix the problem. And if you can make that case to me, I'll join you and I'll support your government program. But I think in general, government tends to be fairly inefficient. And I like the idea of society being a kind of Jackson Pollock painting rather than a pyramid. I think a lot of people think of the government as the thing that sits on top of the pyramid and society's all underneath it. And I think of the government more like a spleen. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a spleen. I think it's important to have a spleen, but it's just a part. You know, there's also families and churches and businesses and things. It's a big, messy, chaotic thing, and the government's the spleen. And so that's how I kind of map it.
Well, we'll be back in just a few minutes to talk a little bit more about who we think's going to win and why and how.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that protects property owners and their interests. Did you know that in 10 states and Washington, D.C., the government can take more than what it is owed in property taxes in the instance of a foreclosure? From 2014 to 2021, 8,600 homes and more than $780 million in savings were lost to this practice, known as home equity theft. We are working to end home equity theft everywhere it remains on the books. Visit PropertyOwnersAlliance.org to join the effort to protect property rights.
Hey, welcome back to the special edition of Lost in the Middle, the countdown as we get closer and closer to the election. And Andrew Heaton's joining me, who's a political podcast host of the Political Orphanage, and as I've joked throughout the show, it's where my political orphans live, since a lot of us feel disengaged from both of the parties. I want to go back. We were just discussing a little bit about libertarianism in the sense that I think this is where both of us are. I mean, I'm very skeptical about the government enforcing morals, and I'm very skeptical about the government's ability to do lots of things they want to try to do. The one thing that Harris did in her opening sort of salvos in the campaigns that gave me the heebie-jeebies was the idea of national rent control, Or the idea that we now set up a commission to fix prices in grocery stores. And Matt, the American grocery store industry depends on margins that are like 1.75%. So you're going to compare the prices of bread across the country and try to figure out who the outlier is. And I don't know what you do with them.
I'm 100% with you in this. This is one of the things that I'm very, I don't even want to say I'm libertarian on. I'm with the economists on this. I don't think that this is something that has a tremendous amount of latitude within economist circles. And when we hear this from our Democrat friends of, we need price controls, it tends to, in my view, come out of almost a medieval worldview of prices go up because of greed. And the whole insight that our greatest president, Adam Smith, had was that self-interest can be greedy at an individual level, but it can be propulsive and pro-social on a macro level. That you like capitalism ends up taking that self-interest and converting it into a pro-social mean that benefits society. And it's a very, very different way of thinking from the Middle Ages, where just things are bad because people are greedy. And so I freak out when I hear people start talking like that, because that to me sounds like we're retrogressing into a sin-based economic worldview, which I don't think benefits it. And it tends to be coupled with, in my mind, a really unhelpful way of understanding economics that's much more rooted in sin. So like with the grocery store example, prices, so far as I understand it, are information. They're not the thing. The cost of the thing is determined by a lot of factors, but mostly by supply and demand. And so if we come in and say you're not allowed to put a price on it, the information communicating that value, you're not actually changing the underlying relationship between the supply and demand. All you're doing is making the problem worse by relieving the market of certain tools that it could do to alleviate it. So it would be like saying, God, I'm fat. I need to cap my weight scale at 100 pounds. That way I don't put on any weight. Like it's too hot. So we're going to get a special thermometer that only goes up to 100. Like all you're doing is playing with the information. You're not playing with the underlying reality. So I very much share your skepticism with that. I will add, that was something that really freaked me out about Kamala Harris, the idea that we were going to have like Nixonian price controls or something to that effect. That was something that she initially was very quantum candidate about, where she didn't really clarify at first whether that was a sweeping Elizabeth Warren-style Soviet bureau reform or if it was just sort of minor emergency gouging. And now that she's put out a policy paper, it seems that she's taking the position of this would be very similar to the states that already have anti-gouging laws on the books. I think they're counterproductive and I would get rid of them. But having a emergency gouging law that says that you can't raise the price of gas 10% after a hurricane, it's counterproductive, but to me is very different than having like a Politburo dictate the prices of bread, which would be much, much, much worse.
Yeah, but it still sort of sounds like economic policy from Bulgaria in the 1970s to me. And the same thing with national rent control. Look, we've got a big problem in this country. There's not enough housing. And so the best way to not have enough housing is to put a fixed price by the government on what you can charge for rent, because people then will just stop building apartment buildings or townhouses or homes. So that was the sort of thing that immediately gave me the heebie-jeebies about the whole thing. So, okay.
I'm with you 100% on that, although Kamala, from what I can tell, what she's trying to do in her position on housing, which is a big priority for me, is she's trying to both juice demand and supply at the same time, which sounds very complicated to me, but she's at least acknowledging that we have overzoning in terms of housing, which we absolutely do. We have way too much zoning that restricts that supply of housing. So she might end up, she seems to be on the one hand, wanting price controls, which I agree are a horrible idea and would disincentivize people from buying new homes. But on the other hand, she might end up being the YIMBY candidate. So there are potential benefits to her in terms of housing.
Okay, let's talk about that other guy who's running. So Trump's craziest idea.
Chase Oliver?
So let's talk about Trump's craziest idea and Trump's maybe one good idea.
Okay. His craziest idea, I think, is the tariffs. I think that's nuts. You could maybe talk me into the position of tariffs are a form of temporary leverage that we have in order to compel other countries to quit doing practices that are harmful to American business, like stealing ideas. I think that there's some legitimacy to that position. But that's never how Trump talks about it. Trump talks about tariffs as if they are a tax on the other country. They're not. their attacks on Americans for having the tenacity to buy foreigners' goods, it squarely falls upon us. You could make the argument that it would build up our industries, but they don't have any traction with me. I think that comparative advantage is a real thing, and that both America and the world have benefited from free trade. So I'm fairly unrepentant in my free trade provisos. I think he's nuts on that. The bit where I think he might be sane, although it's really occluded by a lot of bravado and swaggering, and I hate to say anything positive about the man. I really don't like Donald Trump, and I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump. But the one bit where I see some potential benefit there is we've had a foreign policy consensus from George W. Bush all the way to Biden, with the exception of Trump. He does seem to be out of kilter with that. The foreign policy consensus that really we've had since Eisenhower is one of liberal internationalism and the idea that the world is safer and better with a robust American presence deployed abroad, actively engaging in security partnerships and actively picking winners and losers in other countries. I am very skeptical of our ability to do those things, and I would love for us to have more of a good neighbor policy where we focused on getting along with everybody rather than trying to have a hand in every pot. And I think Trump could potentially be the candidate that does that. Although he never comes out and really explains a foreign policy perspective or an underlying ideology, he always frames it as Putin respects me, he doesn't respect you. So it might all be babbling idiocy. But if I were going to make the absolute best good faith argument in favor of Trump that I could, it would be that he's potentially a realist, whereas everybody else is the old neocon Bush.
Okay, as we wind down here, this is going to be like an NFL show where you have to pick the score of the Bills-Jets game. President, Senate, House.
I think that the Republicans will take the Senate, the Democrats will take the House and the White House.
Andrew Heaton, you can listen to him on the Political Orphanage. Great guest, Andrew. We had a blast. Have fun in Scotland. Avoid the haggis if you can.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to talk to you, Scott. To your listeners, come check out the Political Orphanage. I'm basically Scott minus the success. Take his opinions and analysis and just relieve a lot of the success you get me. So come hang out and good to talk to you, Scott.
Thank you. If you like this episode of Lost in the Middle, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and pals.